Well, good evening. Looks like you'll get an early start this evening because of some of our speakers not showing up. My name is Arthur Blume. I go by Art. I'm a professor of clinical psychology at Washington State University on the west coast of the United States of America. It's really great to be here. This is fortunately the second time I've been to Greece. So I'm very excited to be here once again. The title of my presentation, Expecting the Best, Experiencing the Worst, Positive Alcohol Expectancies, and Negative Consequences. So traditionally, the conventional understanding has been that if you drink a lot of alcohol, you'll experience a lot of consequences. And conversely, if you don't drink as much alcohol, you'll experience much less consequences. That is a conventional understanding. The interesting thing about the research has been, it has been mixed. So you would think that there would be a pretty strong relationship between the level of drinking that people have and the number of consequences they're experiencing. But the findings over time have ranged all over the place, with some strong relationships found to actually some quite modest relationships found in other studies. So we've known for a significant period of time that there are probably other things besides the amount of drinking that may be associated with the experience of consequences. So one of the earliest studies was conducted by G. Allen Marlatt, who was a pretty famous addiction psychologist. He went on in his career to develop the relapse prevention therapy, was one of the pioneers in harm reduction therapy, wrote the book in it, and also did mindfulness-based relapse prevention in the later stages of his career. Well, one of his earliest studies, it was a very ingenious study where he enlisted alcohol-dependent subjects, and then he randomly assigned to 4 different cell conditions. So the manipulations were drinking to intoxication or not drinking any alcohol at all. And in the other cell, the manipulation was being told that they were drinking to intoxication or being told that they weren't. So the study ended up with what we call the balanced placebo design study with 4 cells where there was a group who drank to intoxication and were told they were drinking to intoxication. There was a group that drank nothing stronger than tonic water, and that's exactly what they were told they were getting. And then the interesting thing are in the other cells where there was a group that was drinking to intoxication but were told they had no alcohol at all, and the other cell being the group that was told that they were drinking to intoxication and all they had was tonic water, no alcohol at all. And the interesting thing is we found placebo effects in that study conducted in 1973 where people had had absolutely no alcohol at all but had been led to believe that they had, and they acted intoxicated, even though they had not been drinking. So even in the early 70s, we knew, and this was, again, this was an alcohol-dependent sample, which turned the field on its head because it was widely believed at that time if people had alcohol, they would lose control. And the people who were in the condition where they'd received enough alcohol to be intoxicated but told they hadn't been drinking at all, believed they hadn't been drinking at all and did not lose control. And in fact, they would assign their beliefs about what had happened to being tired or not taking good care of themselves rather than a chemical effect of drinking. So in fact, that study took out the amount that people were consuming sort of out of the equation entirely, which is what the red X is signifying, that beliefs are pretty potent predictors, and we've seen this replicated over and over again, of what people do and how they perceive their drinking behavior. So if beliefs led to intoxicated behavior, independent of consumption, would not beliefs impact other consequences, other independent of consumption as well? And so that's where a series of studies has led us to examine how do people's beliefs actually become associated with the kinds of negative consequences they're experiencing, which they assign to drinking, but in reality, when we tease it apart, may be independent of drinking altogether. So one of the areas that's been really heavily studied is with regard to positive outcome expectancies. So these are beliefs that people have, the positive beliefs they have about what will happen after they drink alcohol. And this comes from Albert Bandura's social learning theory model. And he also, of course, contributed another area of beliefs that are very critically important to overcoming addictions, and that's self-efficacy. So the expected outcomes from addictive behaviors that are called positive outcome expectancies will be things like drinking will make me feel better physically, or it'll make me more assertive, or it'll make me more sexually attractive to other people, or it may empower me in some way. And so these outcome expectancies come in different classifications or typologies. And we know that these have been found over time to be very potent predictors of how much people will drink. What we didn't know until a series of studies is whether they also would predict consequences independent of the amount of drinking that was occurring in the subject. And so the first study that we did in our lab was, oh my goodness, it's now 12 years ago. And basically that was a cross-sectional study, and you can see that the results were that, yes, indeed, consumption did predict consequences that you might predict over the previous 3 months, but an independent amount of variance of consequences was also predicted by positive outcome expectancies after controlling for the amount of consumption that was occurring. And then you fast forward through a number of other studies to the most recent study, which is, was published just recently. And what you see is, yes, after controlling for consumption once again, these positive outcome expectancies were predicting the number of consequences over a 3-month period in a longitudinal study as well. So what you see is that independent of the amount of consumption that's happening, people's beliefs are predicting a small but pretty consistent amount of variance in the amount of consequences that people are experiencing. Either before, so looking retrospectively, or looking prospectively. So with this particular study, we wanted to take it a step further. So we actually took one study that's in press, and we are comparing it with another study that's in process. So what we wanted to do was look at how types of alcohol outcome expectancies, rather than total numbers, might be associated with different types of alcohol-related consequences. So with the idea that these different expectancies, as I mentioned, had different classifications of what kind of outcome, positive outcome people were expecting, and that there might be some linkage between those typologies of outcome expectancies and the kinds of consequences that they would be experiencing. So the study that's in press, it's an Addictive Behaviors Reports, it's coming out next month, was looking at regular drinkers aged 18 to 30, and then we have this in process study where we're actually looking at drinkers who are over 31 or years or older. And so what we wanted to look at was whether these patterns might differ by age group. So whether young adult drinkers might have a different series of predictors positive outcome expectancies for different kinds of consequences than older or middle adult drinkers and older would. So the measures in both of these studies mirror each other. So we used a study pattern chart from the Form 90. This was a timeline follow-back approach. It's a drinking diary for understanding what people have been drinking, what their patterns of drinking have been. It actually provides a great deal of data, and it's done over a 90-day period. It was used in the US Project MAT study, which was a very huge, very expensive study that tested a variety of different therapies, including motivational interviewing and cognitive behavioral therapy. The drinker's inventory of consequences is the consequences measure. It mirrors the consumption measure in that it assesses for the last 90 days, and it's a 50-item self-report assessment of these different consequences. The alcohol expectancy questionnaire has been around a long time. It's a 90-item assessment of different kinds of positive outcome expectancies that people expect when they've been drinking alcohol. So all of these are actually gold standard measures that are used not only in the United States, but in Australia and Europe as well. So because we're looking at types, whether types predict types, we are interested in the subscales. So the alcohol expectancy questionnaire has 6 subscales. Global positive changes, which is really about how people feel better just generally speaking. Increased social assertiveness is exactly what it sounds like. Arousal and aggression has to do with personal empowerment of people, so the belief that alcohol could do that. Relaxation and tension reduction, often related to stress reduction and also self-medication sorts of things. Physical and social pleasure and sexual harassment. And the drink also has 5 subscales of its own, and these are 5 different categories of consequences that people are looking at. So physical consequences, intrapersonal, which would be within-person consequences and change within persons that people don't like about themselves. Social irresponsibility having to do with people do in terms of like work-related expectations, etc. Interpersonal consequences and impulse control consequences. So you would think, that some of these would naturally map onto others. Some of these expectancies would naturally map onto these consequences. So for example, with physical consequences, you might expect that relaxation and tension reduction expectancies might map onto those physical consequences, or that physical pleasure might map on, or sexual enhancement. So each of these things might be hypothesized to be associated. So I'm going to go through this. It's going to be tough to see because I'm putting 2 studies together, but I'll bring it all together in a way that'll make sense in just a minute. So these are the multiple regression analyses with all the alcohol expectancy questionnaires, scale scores included with controlling for consumption. And the left-hand side chart has to do with a study that's been published, and this is the sample 18 to 30 years of age. The right hand on each of these slides will be the study in process. And so what you should know about this is that both models are significant. And what are the significant predictors? Well, consumption, as you might imagine, but for the different age groups, as hypothesized, different kinds of alcohol expectancies are carrying the weight here of the significant models. So for the young adults, what we see is arousal and aggression, which has to do with personal empowerment, is a significant predictor, whereas for the middle and older adults, the significant predictor is global positive expectancies. So with intrapersonal consequences, we see a fairly similar model that's also significant. So again, consumption for both samples is statistically significant. But independent of that, we see once again arousal and aggression for the younger age sample is a significant predictor, and global positive outcomes for the older sample. So we're beginning to see a pattern that's developing that may be age-related differences. Interpersonal consequences. So here, once again, consumption is a significant predictor. And after you take consumption out of the equation for the younger sample, once again, for interpersonal consequences, arousal and aggression is the significant predictor. And when you look at the older age group, you actually don't find that any of the alcohol expectancy questionnaire subscales is significant in the model. For social responsibility, same thing. Consequences, significant predictor. Arousal and aggression is a significant predictor for the younger age group. In the older age group, global positive alcohol expectancies is significant. And then finally, when we get to impulse control, things are a little different. So consequences, again, are significant, but none of the alcohol expectancy questionnaire typologies are significant for either age group, which seems to suggest, and this will probably make some sense, that impulse control consequences may be a different kind of issue than we see in some of these other kinds of consequences. So when we compare the results, and this will bring a little more clarity to this, what I was telling you. So for the sample age 18 to 30, consumption was significantly associated with all types of consequences. In the sample age 31 plus, consumption was significantly associated with all types of consequences. The differences are in the kinds of expectancies that are predicting significantly. Arousal and aggression was significantly associated with 4 out of the 5 types of consequences. So it seems to be a very important thing to focus on clinically for sample ages 18 to 30. But also, there were no significant typologies of expectancies found for impulse control for either group. Now, with the older group, global positive expectancies were significantly associated with physical consequences, with interpersonal consequences, and with social irresponsibility. So before talking about what this may mean, it's important to note that these are small samples. The sample for the published paper was a sample of 85. The sample that's ongoing is very small, it's 28. But on the other hand, if you had been able to see the Durbin-Watson statistics, they were very good. They were between 1.5 and 2.5, so it's not as much concern. But we will see as the other study unfolds, whether these results hold. It was non-random sampling involved. There was only use of one measure each for the construct of interest, which is probably not ideal. So we're not as sure about the generalizability. And no AEQ scale scores were significantly associated with impulse control consequences for either group. But on the other hand, this is the first study to examine how patterns of expectancies may be associated with different types of consequences and how that may vary by age grouping. And perhaps what it suggests, if anything, is that cognitive interventions should vary by age when we're talking about expectancy challenges, for example. Because the theme of empowering young adults was pretty commonly seen in those expectancies. And so it would suggest that maybe if we can find ways to empower these young adults apart from drinking, that we may have something. And then on the other hand, there's some suggestion that feeling better, just generally feeling better, would be helpful for the middle and older adult drinkers. And so if those results continue to hold, then you might want to look at an intervention that would use that as a theme. So consumption significantly associated with consequences. That's the conventional understanding that we started with. A modest but significant amount of variance of consequences attributable to expectancies after controlling for consumption. And so that continues to challenge the conventional understanding. And that beliefs continue to be a pretty potent predictor of drinking behavior, and in some times independent of drinking at all. So harm reduction strategies may be promising, because what this means is if the people are experiencing consequences that are independent of consumption, then you could potentially intervene on those consequences by doing some of the things I mentioned, perhaps can reduce the harmful consequences that people are experiencing without necessarily impacting the level of drinking that they're engaging upon. Strategies may need to vary by age-related differences and expectancies, so empowering young adults in non-drinking ways and addressing well-being in older adults. So it's early, lots of work needs to be done, but it's pretty interesting results, and if they continue to hold up, it does tend to suggest that there may be some age-related differences in these belief patterns. So thank you very much for your time. I'm glad that you decided to stay with us tonight. Oh, we have one more? Somebody else showed up?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Terrific. Oh, any questions?